Get off the platform, Harlan Briggs said, loud enough for half the town to hear. He didn't even look at her when he said it. He was talking to the station master, but his voice carried the way a man's voice carries when he wants it to, when he wants witnesses. Tell me that old woman didn't come off Warren Blackwood's train. The station master said nothing. Most people in Red Hollow knew better than to answer Harlan Briggs when he used that tone. Harlan turned then, slowly. The way a man turns when he's already decided what he thinks and just wants everyone watching to confirm it. He looked Margaret Ellison up and down, her wool coat worn thin at the elbows, her single leather suitcase, the quiet steadiness in her face, and he laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not even a cruel one, exactly. It was something worse. It was the laugh of a man who thought what he was seeing was simply ridiculous, beneath serious consideration. Warren Blackwood sent away for a wife, Harlan announced, still laughing, turning back to the small crowd that had gathered on the platform the way people always gathered when a train came in. And they sent him a grandmother. A few people laughed. Some looked away. Margaret heard every word. She picked up her suitcase and kept walking. If that story already has you leaning forward, if you already want to know whether Margaret Ellison proved every one of them wrong, then you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel was made for. Hit subscribe right now and turn on your notifications, because every week we bring you stories about ordinary people who refuse to be written off, and you will not want to miss a single one. And before you keep watching, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I put these stories out, and I never know how far they travel. Help me find out. Now, let's go back to Red Hollow Station, December 1885, and the woman Harlan Briggs laughed at. Warren Blackwood had been standing on that platform for 40 minutes before the train arrived, and in those 40 minutes he had changed his mind approximately 11 times. He hadn't told anyone what time the train was coming in. He'd hoped to avoid exactly this: the cluster of men outside the feed store, the women pretending to examine goods in the dry goods window while actually watching the tracks. Red Hollow was not a large town. New arrivals were entertainment. A mail-order bride was a story people would be telling each other all winter. He pulled his coat tighter and watched the horizon for smoke. He was 53 years old and had not made many decisions in his life that he was proud of. The ranch had been his father's, and before that his grandfather's, and Warren had done a reasonable job of not losing it, which was less heroic than it sounded because there had been several winters where losing it had been a genuine possibility. He had been married once, a long time ago, to a woman named Clara who died of fever before they'd been together 5 years. He did not talk about Clara. There was nothing useful to say about her that he could say out loud without his throat doing something embarrassing. The advertisement had been his foreman's idea originally. Clem had sat across from him at the kitchen table one February night, watching Warren eat a cold supper alone, and had said carefully, "You know they got a paper out of Chicago, runs notices for—" And Warren had told him flatly that he wasn't interested. That had been 3 years ago. Last spring, Clem had left to take a position on a larger spread near Billings, and Warren had found himself eating cold suppers alone again, except now there wasn't even anyone to ignore. He'd written the letter in April. He'd felt ridiculous the entire time he was writing it. He described the ranch honestly: remote location, hard winters, no neighbors for 6 miles, livestock operation, no guarantee of comfort. He described himself honestly, which was harder. Widower, no children, not a young man, not a wealthy one. Straightforward, reasonable. He didn't embellish. He had received 14 responses. He had written back to 7. He had corresponded for 3 months with a woman named Margaret Ellison, a widow from Pennsylvania, 56 years old, who had answered his advertisement with a letter that contained no flattery and no performance. She'd listed what she knew how to do. She could cook, preserve, sew, manage accounts, handle livestock, and had spent 30 years on a working farm before her husband's death, and a string of bad luck stripped away what they'd built. She wrote plainly. She asked practical questions about the water situation and whether the roof held in heavy snow. He'd liked that she asked about the roof. They'd written back and forth through June, July, and into August. Her letters were direct and sometimes funny in a dry way that surprised him. She didn't pretend the situation was romantic. She was 56 years old, and she'd told him frankly that she wasn't looking for sentiment. She was looking for a place to be useful and a person worth being useful to. He had read that sentence 3 times. He'd sent her a train ticket in September. Now it was December, and the train was pulling in, and Warren was standing on the platform with his hat in his hands, feeling like an absolute fool, and Harlan Briggs was standing 20 feet away making sure that feeling stuck. Harlan owned the Silver Bow Saloon and 3 buildings on the main street and a sizable parcel of grazing land that abutted Warren's eastern fence line, and he had been a persistent thorn in Warren's side for the better part of a decade. It was nothing dramatic, no single great feud, no exploding confrontation. Just the steady wearing friction of a man who had more money and wanted more land and resented anyone who declined to be impressed by either. Harlan was 60 years old and had never struggled for anything in his life in any way that had built character, and it showed. He'd arrived at the station, Warren suspected, specifically because he'd found out about the advertisement. Harlan found out about most things. The train slowed. Steam billowed across the platform. Warren put his hat back on. The passenger door opened. He watched the steps. A young couple came down first, a man in a traveling suit, a family with 2 small children who immediately ran in opposite directions while their mother called after them in an exhausted voice. Then Margaret Ellison stepped onto the platform, and Warren's first thought, which he was not proud of and did not share with anyone, was that she looked exactly like her letters. He couldn't have explained that if anyone asked. She was a woman he'd never seen before, in her late 50s, with gray-streaked dark hair pinned back, and a coat that had seen better winters, and a leather suitcase that she carried herself without looking around for help. Her face was not beautiful in any conventional sense the dime novels would have described. It was a face that had been through things. Lines around the eyes, around the mouth. A stillness to it that wasn't coldness, more like someone who had learned that reacting to everything that happened was a waste of energy you might need later. She stepped onto the platform and she looked around, taking in the station, the town beyond it, the frozen hills in the distance. She didn't look frightened. She didn't look thrilled. She looked like a woman assessing a situation. That was when Harlan made his announcement. Warren was already moving toward her when the laugh happened. He heard it. He saw Margaret hear it, saw the slight tightening around her jaw, the fraction of a second where something moved behind her eyes. Then it was gone. She picked up her suitcase and kept walking, right toward Warren, and when she reached him, she extended her hand with the same directness she'd had in her letters. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I hope I haven't kept you waiting long." "Train was on time," he said. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm. "I'm glad you arrived safely, Mrs. Ellison." Behind him, he could hear Harlan still talking, something about Warren robbing the cradle in reverse, and a few obliging chuckles from the men around him. Warren didn't turn around. He picked up Margaret's suitcase. She let him, which he appreciated. She didn't make a production of refusing. And he said, "My wagon's just around the side. It's about an hour's drive to the ranch." "I read the description you gave," she said, falling into step beside him. "Remote. I've done remote before." "It's a particular kind of remote," he said. "Winter especially." "How's the roof holding?" He almost smiled. "Better than last year." Behind them, Harlan Briggs was still performing for the crowd. Warren kept walking and didn't give him the satisfaction of looking back, and Margaret Ellison walked beside him as if the sound of a man's contempt was something she had already classified as irrelevant. The road to the ranch was frozen solid, and the wind had an edge to it that promised more weather before nightfall. Warren drove and Margaret sat beside him on the wagon bench, and they said very little for the first 20 minutes, which did not feel uncomfortable. She watched the landscape. He watched the horses and the road. "How long has the ranch been in your family?" she asked after a while. "My grandfather built the first structure in 1841, he said. "My father expanded it. I've been running it alone for about 9 years. "What size herd?" 42 head currently, was larger. Hard winter 3 years back. He paused. "I'm not going to pretend the operation is thriving. I said that in my letters and I'll say it again in person. It's a working ranch and it needs work." "I didn't come for a resort," she said. "I know. I'm just making sure." She looked at him then, directly, the way she'd looked at the landscape, like she was taking an honest inventory. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm 56 years old. I've been a widow for 4 years. In those 4 years, I have lived in 3 different places, each one someone's charity, and I have spent a considerable amount of energy being grateful in ways I did not feel. I answered your advertisement because you described a situation that required someone competent, and I am competent. I'm not looking for a comfortable arrangement. I'm looking for a real one." Warren let a moment pass. The horse's breath made clouds in the cold air. "That's about what your letters said," he told her. "I try to be consistent." He nodded. "The ranch has a main cabin, a barn, a smokehouse that needs work, and a bunkhouse that's empty since my foreman left. It's not large. We'll be in close quarters." "I've read about frontier marriages, Mr. Blackwood," she said, with a dryness that was not unkind. "I'm not under illusions about what this is." "I want to make sure you're not under illusions about what it isn't either," he said. "I'm not a man who—" He stopped, started again. "I was married before, for a short time. I don't find conversation easy. I work long hours. I'm not unpleasant company, but I'm also not what you'd call entertaining." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "My husband talked constantly," she said, "from morning until he fell asleep in the chair. 31 years. I loved him, but the quiet has been the easiest thing about being alone." She paused. "I think we'll get along fine." Warren glanced at her sideways. He thought she might be right. The ranch emerged from the winter landscape the way all working ranches do. Not dramatically, not like something from a painting, but gradually, piece by piece, revealing its imperfections as it came into view. The fence line first, weathered posts, one section with wire that sagged badly and needed replacing. Then the barn, solid enough, but with a dark patch on the roof where something had been patched imperfectly. Then the cabin, low-roofed, stone chimney trailing smoke, windows glowing with the fire Warren had kept banked since morning. He watched her take it in. She didn't say anything for a long moment. "It's real," she said, finally. He wasn't sure what she meant by that, but it didn't sound like a complaint. He helped her down from the wagon and showed her through the cabin, which he had cleaned thoroughly and was still deeply aware was a place that a woman like Clara would have wept quietly over when no one was watching. The main room served as kitchen and sitting area. There was a table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove. The bedroom was small. He'd put clean linens on, his best ones, which were not very impressive. He showed her the pantry with its current provisions, which were adequate but would benefit from someone who knew what they were doing with them. Margaret walked through each room the way she'd walked off the train platform. Not rushing, not performing a reaction, just looking at things directly and thinking. "Where do you want me to start?" she asked. "I'm sorry?" "In the morning. Where's most urgent?" He stared at her. "Mrs. Ellison, you just arrived. You don't need to—" "I traveled for 4 days," she said. "I slept on a train. I'm not fragile." She looked at the pantry again. "Your salt pork is going to turn if it's not addressed. And you've got moisture getting in somewhere along the north wall. You can smell it. I'd like to look at that tomorrow." Warren stood in the doorway of his own kitchen feeling, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, like he had just been organized. "The barn animals will need feeding at first light," he said slowly. "After that, there's fence to check on the eastern side." "Then I'll start with the barn," she said. She set her suitcase down by the bedroom door and moved to the stove and picked up the pot that Warren had left there, and she smelled what was in it, and she said, without turning around, "Do you have any dried onion?" "In the top shelf," he said. "Left side." "Then supper will be ready in about an hour." He stood there a moment longer. Then he went back outside to see to the horses, and he thought carefully that he had no idea what was going to happen next. The next morning came gray and cold with a low cloud ceiling that Warren recognized. He was up before light, the way he always was, and he found Margaret already at the stove. This surprised him. He didn't know what he'd expected. She'd had a long journey. He'd assumed she'd sleep. "You didn't have to get up," he said. "I know," she said. She handed him a cup of coffee. "How long have those clouds been building?" He took the coffee, looked out the window. "Since yesterday afternoon." "What's your read on it?" He thought about being reassuring. He looked at her face and decided she didn't want that. "Could be nothing," he said. "Could be a hard blow by nightfall. This territory, the bad ones come up faster than you'd expect." She nodded. "What needs to be moved inside if it comes on hard?" "Hay from the south stack. And there are tools stored in the lean-to east of the barn that would be lost if the snow came heavy. Then let's start with those, she said, and handed him a second cup that he realized she'd had ready for herself. And then she put on the coat she'd hung by the door the night before and she went outside. Warren followed her. Around mid-morning, when they were still moving hay and the sky had gotten noticeably darker and the wind had picked up a cold, purposeful edge, he heard a horse on the road. He recognized the horse before he could see the rider clearly. Harlan Briggs pulled up at the fence line and looked at the two of them. Warren with his arms full of hay, Margaret beside him doing the same, and he had the expression of a man who had expected to find something disappointing and was not disappointed. "Blackwood," he said. "Hard at work, I see." His eyes went to Margaret. He didn't greet her. "I came to talk to you about the eastern fence line, the one that borders my grazing land." "There's nothing to talk about," Warren said. "That's my fence on my land." "Your fence is in a state of disrepair that's allowing my cattle to wander," Harlan said. "I've had 2 animals lost in the past month. I'll be expecting compensation." "Your cattle wouldn't wander if you didn't overgraze your own land," Warren said. His voice was flat. This was an old argument. Harlan smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'd suggest you get your affairs in order, Warren. A man in your financial position can't afford complications." His gaze moved to Margaret again, slow, deliberate, making a point of looking at her coat, her work-roughened hands, the hay she was carrying. "Or additional burdens." Margaret set down her load of hay. She looked at Harlan Briggs with an expression that Warren could not read. Not anger, not embarrassment, something more patient than either. She said, in a calm and conversational tone, "Mr. Briggs, your cattle aren't wandering because of Warren's fence." Harlan looked at her as if a piece of furniture had spoken. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I walked the eastern fence line this morning at first light," she said, "before we started moving the hay. The fence is sound. There's a section of your fence, on your land, about 200 yards north of the property boundary that's been cut." Silence. Harlan's expression did not change in the way it would have changed if he were surprised. "Cut," Warren repeated. He looked at Margaret. "Clean cuts," she said, "not a break from pressure or age. Fence wire doesn't break that cleanly on its own." She looked back at Harlan. "I'd imagine cattle that get through a cut fence might end up on neighboring land. Might make it look like the neighboring fence was at fault." Harlan stared at her for a long moment. "You've been here one day," he said. "I have good eyes," she said pleasantly. Harlan looked at Warren. Something had shifted in his expression, buried under the surface. "You'd want to be careful about making accusations," he said. "In a town like this, a man's reputation matters. And a woman's." "I didn't make an accusation," Margaret said. "I described what I observed. Those are different things." Harlan gathered his reins. He looked between them. Warren, who was watching him steadily now, and Margaret, who had picked her load of hay back up. "Get your fence fixed," Harlan said. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward town. Warren watched him go. "Cut fence," he said after a moment. "Yes," Margaret said. "You saw that this morning. I walked the line while you were checking the water situation in the barn. I wanted to know what we were dealing with before anything else, so..." She paused. "Has he done things like this before?" Warren was quiet for a moment. The wind cut across the open ground between them. "He's been pushing on the eastern boundary for a long time," he said. "I've never been able to prove anything." "Then you needed someone to look at it fresh," she said. She started moving toward the barn. "We should finish the hay before that weather comes in." Warren stood still for a moment longer, looking at the road where Harlan's horse had disappeared. Then he picked up his load and followed her. The storm hit just before dark, and it hit hard. Warren had seen 100 Montana winters, and he knew a serious blow when it started, and this one came in with intention. The wind first, a wall of it that made the barn door rattle on its hinges, then the snow, heavy and fast, the kind that could bury a fence post in 2 hours and fill in a road in 3. By the time they'd eaten supper and the dark had come fully down, the world outside the cabin windows was nothing but moving white. "How are the animals?" Margaret asked. She was at the table with his account ledger open. He'd handed it to her without much thought, something about the way she'd looked at the pantry provisions, and she'd taken it without comment and had been working through it for the past hour. "Settled for now?" he said. "If the temperature drops further, I'll need to check on the calves." "How many calves?" "3. Born in November, which was later than I wanted." She nodded, making a note. "Your feed supply," she said, without looking up. "You're going to come up short by February if we have another week like the one in—" She turned back a page. "1883. "I know," he said. "What's your access to credit at the general store?" He told her. She thought about it. "It's manageable if we're careful," she said, "but there's no margin. Any unexpected loss, animal, equipment—" She left it there. "I know," he said again. He looked up at him then. Whatever she saw on his face, he wasn't sure what it was. He wasn't a man who spent much time examining his own expressions. She didn't offer false comfort. She said, "I've run accounts that were tighter than this and come out the other side. It requires knowing exactly where every dollar goes." "That's something I've never been good at," he admitted. It cost him something to say it. "I am," she said simply. Not bragging, just stating a fact about herself. She went back to the ledger. Warren sat across from her and listened to the wind try to push the storm through the walls. And he thought about the ranch and the eastern fence and Harlan Briggs's expression when Margaret had described the cut wire. And he thought that in 24 hours this woman had already changed the shape of things in ways he couldn't entirely account for. He thought about Clara. He thought about how Clara had been warm and quick to laugh and had loved him fiercely and had been entirely unsuited to the harsh, specific loneliness of the Montana frontier, and how that was not a fault but a fact, and how her death had left him with a grief he'd never properly set down. He thought that Margaret Ellison was nothing like Clara. He thought that this was possibly exactly what the situation required. Outside, something crashed, loud enough that they both looked up. A piece of the barn overhang, probably. In weather like this, things came loose. Warren was already reaching for his coat. Margaret was reaching for hers. "You don't need to come," he said. "I wasn't asking permission," she said. She didn't say it sharply. She said it the same way she said most things, evenly, like a statement of simple fact, like the idea that she might stay inside while he went out alone into the dark, and the storm was a category error, something that didn't apply to the kind of person she was. Warren looked at her. She was buttoning her coat with hands that moved steadily despite the fact that the cabin temperature had dropped a full 10 degrees in the last hour. "The wind's going to be bad," he said. "I've been in wind before," she said. He handed her his spare pair of work gloves. They were too large for her hands. She put them on without comment. He pushed open the door, and the storm came in to meet them, and they went out into it together. In the darkness and the howling cold, with the snow coming at them sideways and the lantern in Warren's hand barely making a dent in the white, something settled in his chest that he hadn't expected to feel that night. He couldn't name it precisely. It wasn't comfort, not exactly. It was something more like the feeling of weight being distributed, the sense of a burden shifted from one set of shoulders to two. He led the way toward the barn, and Margaret Ellison stayed beside him step for step, and the storm screamed around them, and neither of them looked back. The barn door had lost one of its upper hinges. Warren saw it the moment the lantern light reached it. The whole left side of the door had pulled away from the frame and was swinging loose, banging against the outer wall with every gust, and the wind was getting in. He could hear the animals before he could see them. The horses were moving in their stalls, hooves shifting on frozen ground, and somewhere in the back he could hear one of the calves making a sound that meant distress. He got his shoulder into the door and held it against the wind while Margaret slid past him into the barn. "Latch on the inside," she called back. Can you get it?" He reached around the broken edge and found the interior latch and threw it, and the door went still, and the screaming of the wind dropped by half. His ears rang in the sudden relative quiet. Margaret was already moving through the barn with the extra lantern she'd grabbed from the cabin hook on the way out. He hadn't even seen her take it. She went to the calves first, which was the right call, and he went after her. The 3 calves were huddled in the corner of their shared pen, and one of them, the smallest one, a brown and white animal Warren had privately been worrying about since November, was shaking. not shivering the way a cold animal shivers, shaking badly. "How old is she?" Margaret said. Not a question, exactly. 7 weeks, Warren said. "She's been the runt." Margaret crouched down without hesitating and put her hands on the calf, neck first, then along the ribs. Then she put her palm flat against the animal's side and held it there. The calf flinched and then stilled. "She's cold through," Margaret said. "Not sick, cold." She looked around the pen. Do you have burlap? Extra blanket, anything?" "Tack room," he said. "West wall." She stood and went, and Warren stayed with the calf and felt, unreasonably, that he should say something reassuring to the animal, even though he'd never been the kind of man who talked to livestock. The calf looked at him with large dark eyes and trembled. Margaret came back with 2 lengths of burlap and a horse blanket that had seen better years. She knelt down again and started wrapping the calf with a practicality that was somehow also gentle. Not rough, not careless, but not making a performance of tenderness either. Just doing what needed doing in the way that worked. "Hold her still," Margaret said, and Warren put his hands on the calf's neck and shoulders and felt the shaking through his palms. "You've done this before," he said. "We had a dairy herd for 20 years, she said, tucking the burlap under the animal's belly. "Lost calves to cold. Learned what you can save and what you can't." She paused. "This one you can save." "How do you know?" She glanced up at him. Her eyes are still clear. She's shaking because she's cold, not because she's given up. She went back to the wrapping. "Animals that have given up look different. You learn to tell." Warren didn't say anything. "The other 2 are fine," she said. "They've got enough body against each other. It's just this one that got separated from the warmth." She finished and sat back and looked at the wrapped calf. "She needs to stay moving a little. Not a lot. Just enough to keep her blood going. Can you stay with her for a few minutes?" "Yes," he said. "Then I'll check the horses." She was gone before he could respond. Warren crouched in the pen with the brown and white calf and kept his hands on her and felt the shaking slowly, incrementally, begin to ease. Outside the barn walls, the storm was in full voice. A deep, sustained roar that he felt more than heard at this point, the kind of sound that became the background of everything during a bad Montana blow. He could hear Margaret talking to the horses. Not words, exactly. Just the steady, low murmur of someone letting an animal know they're not alone. He hadn't expected that. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Someone to stand at the barn door and wait for him to handle it, maybe. Someone to defer. He thought about Harlan Briggs on the road that morning. I'd be expecting compensation. And then Margaret, calm and factual. Your fence wire doesn't break that cleanly on its own. She'd been here one day. She'd walked the fence line at first light on her first morning, in a temperature that made most people want to stay near any available heat source, and she'd looked at things carefully and seen what was there to see. The calf pressed her nose against his arm. The shaking had mostly stopped. Warren let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Margaret came back from the horses. "They're settled," she said. "The gray one. Is she always that anxious in wind?" "Bess," he said. "Yes. She's been that way since I got her, storm-shy. She needs something to focus on. I braided some hay into the front bar of her stall. Gives her something to work at. It helps." He stared at her. "Where did you learn that?" "Old trick," she said. "Nervous horses need occupation. Idle animals worry." She looked at the calf. "Better?" "Better," he said. She looked up at the hinge that had failed. What remained of it hung from 2 screws on the frame side. "That's not going to hold the door through the night," she said. "I know. I'll need to brace it from the inside. I saw a length of timber near the south wall when I came in, about 6 feet. Would that work?" He thought about it. "If I can get the angle right." "Show me what you need," she said. They spent the next 30 minutes bracing the barn door against the storm. It was not elegant work. The timber was heavier than it looked, and the angle was awkward, and Warren dropped the hammer twice in the cold and said something under his breath the second time that he was immediately aware of, and Margaret, who was holding the timber steady with both hands, said, without changing her expression, "I've heard worse." "Sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. "I've said worse." He almost laughed. He didn't, but it was close. When the brace was in, they stood back and looked at it. The door held. The wind pushed, and it held. "It'll do," Warren said. "It'll do," she agreed. They made a full circuit of the barn after that, checking every animal, checking the roof where snow was accumulating, checking the south wall where he'd always suspected a gap in the insulation that he'd never properly addressed. Margaret found the gap, put her hand flat against the wall, and felt the cold coming through and said, "There," like she was identifying something on a map. He stuffed it with loose hay as a temporary measure and made a mental note that added to the long list of mental notes he'd been accumulating for 9 years alone. By the time they came back inside the cabin, it was past 10 o'clock, and the storm showed no sign of reducing itself, and they were both tired in the particular way of physical work done in cold air, which was a different kind of tired than ordinary exhaustion. Warren built the fire up, and Margaret went to the stove and heated water and made something from the pantry that turned out to be a reasonable version of oat porridge, which was not what he would have called a 10 o'clock meal, but which he ate without complaint because he was hungry, and it was warm. "The calf will be all right through the night?" Margaret asked. She was sitting across from him, hands wrapped around her cup. "Should be," he said. "I'll check again before I sleep." She nodded. "I'll come." "You don't have to?" "Warren." She said his name. Not Mr. Blackwood, just his name, and it was the first time she'd done it. It stopped him mid-sentence. "I'm not a visitor," she said. "I'm not a guest. I'm not a burden you have to manage. The sooner we stop having this particular exchange, the better it'll go for both of us." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to protect you," he said. I'm not used to..." He stopped, started again. "I've been doing this alone for a long time. I don't have good habits for having someone else here." "I noticed," she said without cruelty. "You apologize every time I do something useful. You don't need to do that." "I don't know what to do instead," he said. It came out more honestly than he'd intended. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She turned her cup in her hands. "Say thank you," she said, "if you feel like it. Or say nothing. But stop apologizing for having help." He thought about that. "Thank you," he said. "For the calf, for the horses, for the fence this morning." She looked at him steadily. "You're welcome," she said. Simple as that. The storm kept on through the night and into the next day, and on the second morning Warren woke to find Margaret already outside, which was becoming a pattern he was going to have to stop being surprised by. He pulled on his coat and boots and followed her and found her at the east side of the cabin with a snow shovel, working on the drift that had built up against the woodpile. "I could have done that," he said. She handed him a second shovel she'd leaned against the wall. "Then come do it," she said. They shoveled together. The snow was deep and heavy, the kind that came in wet and packed solid, and it was slow work. Warren's shoulders felt it in the first 10 minutes. He watched Margaret work. Steady pace, no wasted movement, not trying to take too much in each lift. She'd done this kind of work before. A long time, and many winters. "Tell me about your farm," he said. "In Pennsylvania." She was quiet for a moment. He wondered if he'd overstepped. "Dairy and grain," she said. "Outside of Lancaster. My husband Edwin's family land, same as this is your family's land. We had it 31 years. She shoveled and threw. Lost it 3 years after Edwin died. Bad debt, bad luck, and a lawyer who knew how to read a contract better than I did." Her voice was level. "I was 53 years old and I had $60, a leather suitcase, and a skill set that nobody in a city has any use for." "I'm sorry," Warren said. "Don't be sorry," she said. "I'm not. I was angry for a long time. That was useful. Anger got me through some nights that might have gone differently. But I'm not angry anymore. That farm is gone. This one..." She stopped shoveling for a moment and looked at the ranch, the snow-covered roofline of the cabin, the barn, the distant fence line. "This one is here." Warren looked at the same view. "It's not much," he said. "Edwin's farm wasn't much when we started," she said. "Most things that become something weren't much when they started." He didn't have anything to add to that. They went back to shoveling. Around mid-morning, with the storm finally starting to thin at the edges the way storms did when they were running out of themselves, Warren heard a horse on the road again. He He stopped shoveling and looked up, and this time it wasn't just Harlan Briggs. It was Harlan Briggs and two men Warren recognized as hands from Harlan's spread, a large man named Dutch, who'd been with Harlan for years, and a younger one Warren didn't know well whose name was possibly Garrett. They pulled up at the fence line, and Harlan looked at the cabin and the cleared path and the two people with shovels, and his expression was the same as it always was, calculating, certain of itself. "Blackwood," he said, "I need to talk to you about the fence, and I've brought witnesses this time." Warren set his shovel against the cabin wall. "Witnesses to what?" "To the state of your eastern fence line, which has been allowing my cattle to trespass on my own grazing land." Harlan pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I've had this drawn up. Formal complaint of property damage and livestock loss. My attorney says—" "Your fence was cut," Margaret said. Harlan looked at her. His expression shifted slightly, a tightening around the eyes. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, with deliberate slowness, emphasizing the name in a way that managed to make it sound dismissive. "I don't know what you think you observed. I observed wire cut with a tool," she said. "Clean cuts at 3 separate points, 200 yards north of the property boundary on your land. I described the location precisely yesterday, and I'll describe it again now to your witnesses if that's useful." Dutch and the younger hand exchanged a look. Harlan did not look at them. "A woman who arrived 2 days ago is not a credible witness to the history of—" "The cuts were fresh," Margaret said. "The wire edges hadn't oxidized. Whatever tool made them was used recently." She paused. "Within the last week, I'd estimate." Silence. The wind moved the loose snow across the ground between them. "You should think carefully," Harlan said, and now the pleasantness was entirely gone from his voice, "about making statements you can't support. In this county, a man with property and standing has certain advantages in disputes. You're new here. You don't have standing. You don't have history." "I have eyes," Margaret said. "Harlan," Warren said, and something in his voice made everyone go still. "I've been walking soft with you for 10 years because this is a small territory and I didn't want trouble. I want you to hear me clearly right now." He was looking at Harlan steadily, and his voice was quiet the way it got when he was actually serious. "Take your paper and your witnesses and your cut fence and go home." Harlan's jaw tightened. "You can't afford a legal fight, Warren. Everyone knows what shape this ranch is in." "You might be surprised," Warren said, "what I can afford." It wasn't true, or not entirely true, and Harlan probably knew that. But he didn't know about the ledger open on Warren's table, or the woman who'd spent the previous evening working through it with the focus of someone who'd rebuilt from nothing before. He didn't know what he was dealing with, and you could see the first edge of that uncertainty move through his expression, just a flicker, just a fraction of a second, before he pulled it back. He folded the paper, put it back in his pocket. "I'll be watching," he said. "I know you will," Warren said. Harlan turned his horse and his men followed, and Warren and Margaret stood in the snow and watched them go. After a moment, Warren picked his shovel back up. Margaret picked up hers. "He's going to come back," she said. "He always comes back," Warren said. "Then we need to document the fence," she said. "Before anything else, the cut wire, the location, the condition, written record, dated and signed. We'd need a witness." "Does anyone in town—" she started. "There's a woman named Agnes Kettridge," Warren said. "She runs the dry goods store. She's been here 20 years, and she doesn't owe Harlan anything. Her husband and Harlan had a dispute over water rights about 5 years back." He paused. "She might. Can we get to town before the roads close again?" He looked at the sky. The storm was thinning, but not done. "Maybe," he said, "if we go now." She was already setting down her shovel. The road to Red Hollow was navigable, barely. The horses had to pick through the drifts in places, and Warren kept them slow where he couldn't see the road surface clearly underneath the snow. Margaret sat beside him on the wagon bench and did not complain about the cold or the pace or the discomfort of a wagon seat in freezing temperatures. She asked him about Agnes Kettridge. He told her what he knew. Sensible woman, 50 or so, ran the store alone since her husband's health failed, known in town as someone who kept her word and her accounts in order. "What do I say to her?" Margaret asked. Tell her the truth, Warren said. That's generally her preference. Agnes Kettridge was behind the counter when they came in, and she looked at Margaret with the frank, direct appraisal of a woman who'd been assessing strangers across a counter for 2 decades. Warren introduced them, and Agnes said, I heard you came in on the Thursday train. And Margaret said, I did. And Agnes said, Harlan Briggs made a fool of himself on that platform. And Margaret said, he seemed comfortable doing it. And Agnes almost smiled. Warren explained the situation. Agnes listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, Cut wire, the way you'd say it when you're filing something away. Clean cuts, Margaret said. 3 points, fresh. 200 yards north of the boundary on Harlan's land. Agnes looked at her for a moment. You're sure of the location? I can draw it, Margaret said. I have a good sense of distances. Agnes reached under the counter and produced a piece of paper and a pencil and set them in front of Margaret without a word. Margaret drew a rough map. The fence line, the boundary marker, the approximate distances, marking the 3 cut points with small X's. Agnes looked at it. That's just north of where Tom, my husband, found 2 of his fencing posts pulled up about 6 years ago, she said. We couldn't prove anything. She picked up the paper. I'll witness the document, and I'll keep a copy here. Warren looked at her. You don't have to get involved in this. Warren Blackwood, Agnes said, I have been involved in resisting Harlan Briggs's particular version of how this county should operate for the better part of a decade. I'm just glad someone finally has eyes sharp enough to catch him at something concrete. She looked at Margaret. Welcome to Red Hollow, Mrs. Blackwood. We've needed someone like you. Margaret accepted this without deflecting it or being visibly moved by it, which Warren thought was characteristic. Thank you, she said. Do you have a notary available? I am a notary, Agnes said, and produced a stamp from somewhere under the counter. They were back on the road inside an hour, with a witnessed and stamped document in Warren's coat pocket, before the next edge of the storm came in and made the road impassable. That night, the temperature dropped hard, the kind of drop that happened fast in Montana in December, where you went from cold to genuinely dangerous in the span of a few hours. Warren added a second log to the fire and went out at 9 o'clock to check the barn, and when he came back, Margaret was at the table with the ledger again, but she'd also pulled out a piece of paper and was writing something in a careful hand. What's that? He asked. List of what we need before February, she said, and what we have, and the gap between them. He sat down across from her. She turned the paper so he could see it. He looked at it. It was organized the way her letters had been, clear, practical, no sentimentality about what was on there. The gap was not small. I know, he said. There are options, she said. None of them easy. She tapped the paper. Your cattle. If you sell early, you lose the winter weight gain. If you hold, you risk feed shortfall. But if Harlan's been cutting your fence, there may be a reason he wants your cattle to appear on his land. Warren looked up. What do you mean? A rancher with stray cattle on his neighbor's land, she said, could, if the law were friendly to him, claim the cattle were abandoned or unclaimed, especially if the rancher in question had financial difficulties that were documented. She paused. Especially if the county assessor happened to be friendly to certain parties. Warren was quiet for a long moment. He wants the cattle, he said. I think he wants the land, she said. The cattle would just be the opening argument. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the storm had come back with a second wind, and the sound of it against the windows was steady and low. I've been thinking about the wrong problem, Warren said. You've been doing the work alone for a long time, she said. When you're doing everything alone, you don't always have time to step back and see the shape of things. He looked at her across the table, at the ledger, and the list, and the stamped document in his coat on the wall hook, at the woman who had walked the fence line in the cold on her first morning and seen what was there to see. What do we do? He said. He meant it as a genuine question. Not rhetorical, not helpless, a question asked to a partner. Margaret looked at the list. First, we document everything, the fence, the cattle count, the financial records, everything dated, everything witnessed. If Harlan intends to use the law as a lever, we make sure we have a better grip on it than he does. She paused. Do you know a lawyer? Not in town. Somewhere Harlan's money doesn't reach? There's a man in Miles City, Warren said slowly. Henderson. I've met him twice. He's honest, I think. Write to him, she said. Tomorrow, before anything else. Warren nodded. Margaret, he said. She looked up. I need to ask you something, he said, and I want an honest answer. I've only given you honest answers, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm asking. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table, the way a man does when he's getting ready to say something he's been carrying for a while. When you answered that advertisement, when you read what I wrote and decided to write back, did you think this was going to be this complicated? She held his gaze. No, she said. I thought it was going to be hard. I didn't know the shape of hard yet. Are you... He stopped. Are you all right? With the shape of it? Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the storm had found its voice again, that deep, sustained note of serious weather, and the fire was doing its best against the cold, and the cabin was small and the situation was complicated, and the list on the table had a gap in it that neither of them had solved yet. I'm better than I've been in 4 years, she said. That's an honest answer. Warren held on to that. He got up and put another log on the fire and went to the window and looked out at the dark and the snow. And he thought about the document in his coat pocket and the letter he would write to Henderson in Miles City tomorrow, and the calf in the barn who had stopped shaking because Margaret had wrapped her in burlap and stayed until the worst passed. He thought that he had been wrong about what he needed for a long time. He'd thought he needed someone to fill the quiet. What he'd actually needed was someone who knew what to do with it. The letter to Henderson in Miles City went out with the mail rider on Monday morning, tucked inside Warren's coat until the last possible moment, as if he were afraid of losing it, which he was. Not the physical letter, but the decision it represented, the act of asking for help from someone outside the fence line, which did not come naturally to him. Margaret watched him hand it over and said nothing, which was the right call. The days after the storm had a particular quality that Warren recognized from other hard winters. A false calm. The world gone quiet and white and deceptively still while everything underneath it was either dying or holding on by its fingernails. The temperature stayed brutal. He and Margaret settled into a working rhythm that neither of them discussed or planned. It simply emerged the way practical things emerge between practical people. He took the barn in the early morning, she took the kitchen and the accounts. They met in the middle for the heavy work and split the fence checks between them. The brown and white calf, which Margaret had taken to calling Button on account of her eyes, was gaining strength. Warren had not named an animal on this ranch in 9 years. He did not comment on this development. Agnes Kettridge sent a note out with a supply delivery on Wednesday. It said only, Harlan was in town asking questions about the Henderson firm in Miles City. Thought you should know. A.K. Warren read it at the table and handed it to Margaret without a word. She read it and set it down. He has someone watching the mail, she said. Probably, Warren said. Then Henderson needs to know that too, she said. Whatever we send him going forward, we should assume Harlan's read it first. He hadn't thought of that. He sat with the discomfort of not having thought of it. We need a way to communicate that goes around Harlan, he said. Agnes, Margaret said. If Henderson sends correspondence to Agnes at the store, addressed as a business matter, supply invoice, something ordinary, Agnes would do it, he said. I think she would, Margaret said. She struck me as someone who understands the value of being underestimated. He wrote to Agnes that afternoon. He kept the letter short and practical, the way she seemed to prefer things. Thursday brought a visitor neither of them expected. Warren was in the barn checking the roof bracing when he heard a wagon and came out to find an old man on a buckboard who introduced himself as Roy Pender, a homesteader whose land sat about 4 miles east, beyond Harlan's property, not adjacent to Warren's, which meant he'd gone around the long way to get here, a significant detour in this weather. Roy Pender was in his mid-60s, weathered the way men get weathered when they've spent most of their lives outdoors, with a face like old leather and eyes that moved carefully over everything before settling. He did not get down from the buckboard immediately. He looked at Warren with the measured distance of someone who wasn't sure of his reception. I heard you got married, Roy said. I did, Warren said. Heard about what happened at the station, Roy said. Harlan. He said the name like it tasted of something. Come inside, Warren said. It's too cold to stand out here. Margaret had coffee ready before Roy had finished unwinding his scarf, which seemed to surprise him. He sat at the table and looked at her with the same careful eyes he'd used on Warren, and she looked back at him steadily. Mrs. Blackwood, he said. He turned the name over, trying it out. I heard you spotted the cut wire. Word travels fast, she said. In winter, there's nothing to talk about but each other's business, he said. It wasn't an apology, just a statement of facts. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at Warren. I've got a problem, and I think it's the same shape as yours. Warren leaned back in his chair. Tell me. Roy Pender's situation took 20 minutes to explain, and by the end of it, Warren and Margaret were both leaning forward over the table. Roy owned 140 acres east of Harlan's land, including a stretch of creek frontage that fed into the same watershed as Warren's eastern pasture. For the past 2 years, Roy had been dealing with what he described as water trouble, the creek running slower in summer than it should, pools that used to stay full going dry, cattle thirsty in months when they'd never been thirsty before. He'd thought weather at first. Bad years happened. But this past summer it had been bad enough that he'd ridden the creek line from his land back toward its source, and what he'd found, half a mile up on what was technically a shared water access corridor, was a diversion, not a natural one. Someone had built a structure, crude but effective, rock and timber, redirecting a portion of the creek flow off the main channel and into a ditch that ran northeast, toward Harlan's land. I couldn't prove who built it, Roy said. I knocked it down. It was rebuilt within 2 weeks. He paused. I knocked it down again. This time, someone cut 3 of my fence posts on the south side. Not broke, they cut. Same as what you found. Margaret and Warren looked at each other. Did you report it? Warren asked. To who? Roy said. He said it without bitterness, just tired practicality. Sheriff Combs and Harlan Briggs have been hunting together for 15 years. I reported the water diversion in August. Combs came out, looked at it, said it appeared to be a natural beaver dam. Roy looked at Warren. It was timber and cut rock. No beaver was involved. Did you document it? Margaret asked. The structure. Before you knocked it down. Roy looked at her. I don't know what you mean exactly. Written record, she said. Description of the materials, the construction, the location, the date you found it, signed and witnessed. I wrote it down, Roy said slowly, but I didn't. Nobody witnessed it. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Can you describe the structure accurately in detail right now? I could draw the damn thing, Roy said. Then do that, she said, and got up and found paper. Roy looked at Warren. Warren spread his hand slightly. Go ahead. And Roy took the paper and the pencil and started drawing. He was not a man with artistic ability, but he was a man who knew what he'd seen, and what came out on the paper was detailed and specific. The rock placement, the timber bracing, the angle of the diversion ditch, the approximate volume of the redirected flow. Margaret watched him draw and asked questions. Roy answered them. How far from the main channel? How much of the flow diverted? What was the condition of the timber? New wood or seasoned? What direction did the ditch run? What happened to the water at the end of the ditch? Roy didn't know the answer to that last one, which Margaret noted. You need to follow it, she said, when the ground thaws. Where that ditch ends is important. I'm one man, Roy said. There are 3 of us at this table, Margaret said. Roy looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not sentimentality. He wasn't a sentimental man. More like the expression of someone who's been carrying a weight alone for a long time and has just been told they can set one end of it down. Agnes Kettridge, Warren said, and Tom, if he's well enough. They had fence trouble 6 years ago. Roy, did you know about that? Roy was quiet. I heard something, he said. Tom never talked about it much. He might talk now, Warren said. If it's part of something larger. What are you saying exactly? Roy said. Warren looked at Margaret. She was looking at the drawing Roy had made, at the documented account of the fence and the water diversion, at the letter from Agnes about the mail, and she had that expression he'd come to recognize in the short time she'd been here. Not alarmed, not uncertain, but very focused, the way a person looks when they're seeing the shape of something clearly. "He's not just being a difficult neighbor," Margaret said. "He's been running a systematic campaign. Water rights, land boundaries, cattle positioning, legal leverage. He's been building towards something for years. He wants consolidation. He wants this entire corridor of the valley." Roy stared at her. "All of our land. Yours, Warren's, probably Tom Kettridge's water access, maybe others," she said. "And he's been doing it slowly enough and individually enough that nobody's seen the whole picture." She paused. "Because nobody's sat at the same table before." The silence that followed had a particular weight. Roy Pender looked at Warren. Warren looked at Roy. Both of them had been in this valley for years. Both of them had been dealing with Harlan's pressure individually, and neither of them had, apparently, ever compared notes in any serious way. Because that was how it worked in isolated country. You dealt with your own trouble on your own land, and you didn't go looking for problems beyond your fence line. Harlan had understood that, Warren realized, had counted on it. "We need Henderson to know all of this," Warren said. "Not just my fence. The water diversion, Roy's fence, Agnes's husband's posts. All of it in one document." "That's a stronger case than any one piece," Margaret said. "It might also make Harlan move faster," Roy said. He wasn't arguing against it, just naming the reality. "He'll move regardless," Margaret said. "The question is whether we're ready when he does." Roy finished his coffee and sat for a moment, looking at the table. Then he looked at Margaret. "You've been here less than 2 weeks," he said. "I have," she said. "How'd you know to walk the fence line first morning?" "Because it was the boundary," she said. "And boundaries are where problems start." Roy Pender nodded slowly, like he was filing that away. He put his hat back on and wrapped his scarf and thanked them for the coffee. And at the door he paused and looked back. "There's a meeting sometimes," he said. "Informal. 3 or 4 families. Started a few years back over the water question. Didn't get anywhere. Maybe it's time to have it again." "At whose place?" Warren asked. "Could be here," Roy said. He looked at Margaret. "If that suits." "It suits," she said. After Roy's wagon had disappeared down the snowy road, Warren and Margaret stood at the window for a moment, watching the cold white landscape and the bare trees and the hard sky. "How many families do you think have been dealing with pieces of this?" she asked. "Could be 6 or 8, Warren said. "This valley's been quietly changing hands for years. I didn't realize how quietly until just now." "He's patient," Margaret said. "That's the most dangerous thing about him. He's been playing this game for years, and he's been doing it one small move at a time so that nobody sees the whole board." "Until someone walks the fence line," Warren said. She turned from the window. "Don't give me too much credit," she said. "I looked because I didn't know what I was looking at yet. Fresh eyes. Anyone who knew this territory too well might have missed it." "But nobody who knew this territory was looking," he said. "That's the point." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the table and picked up Roy's drawing and began writing notations around the margins in her careful hand, adding the distances and the dates Roy had confirmed and the description of the timber quality. Warren watched her for a moment. Then he said, "There's something I need to tell you." She looked up. "Harlan came to me 2 years ago," he said. "Made an offer on the ranch. Fair market price, maybe slightly above. I turned him down, and I didn't think much more about it because I thought he was just—" He stopped. "I thought it was a one-time thing." "How long after that did the fence trouble start?" she asked. He thought about it. 4 months, maybe?" She nodded, like she'd expected that. "He doesn't take no as a permanent answer," she said. "He takes it as a starting position. I should have—" "It's not useful to go back," she said. "What matters is the record from now forward. Every incident, every date, every name. Document everything we can prove and don't claim what we can't." She paused. "When Henderson responds, he'll tell us what we actually have. Until then, we build the file." They built the file. It took several days and it was not exciting work. It was the kind of careful, detailed, unglamorous labor that never looked significant from the outside. Margaret organized it. She created a system, dated entries, each one describing a specific incident, listing what was observed, who observed it, whether there were witnesses, and what physical evidence existed. Warren contributed the timeline from his own experience. Fence repairs he'd made that he'd attributed to ordinary wear, cattle that had drifted in ways he'd thought were random, a water trough that had gone dry 2 summers running on the east pasture. Laid out in sequence, dated and in order, it stopped looking random. Agnes sent word that Tom Kettridge wanted to talk. His health wasn't good enough for him to travel, but Agnes said he'd remembered things about the fence post incident and the water rights discussion he'd had with Harlan years ago that he wanted to write down while he still could remember them clearly. Did they want her to take the statement? Margaret wrote back through Agnes's supply delivery system. Yes, please. All the detail he can provide. 2 days later, Agnes sent out a 3-page handwritten account in Tom Kettridge's shaky script, describing a conversation he'd had with Harlan Briggs in the fall of 1879, in which Harlan had explicitly stated his intention to control what Tom called the water corridor through the valley, and had suggested that Tom might want to consider selling his water access easement before its value went elsewhere. Tom had refused. His fence posts had been pulled up the following spring. Margaret read the account twice. Then she said quietly, "He's been doing this for 6 years minimum." "Probably longer," Warren said. "Tom's account gives us a starting point," she said. "It establishes intent. That's what Henderson will need most, not just the individual incidents, but the pattern. Intent over time." She added Tom's account to the file and wrote a summary page that laid out the timeline from 1879 to the present, connecting the incidents into a single coherent picture. Warren read the summary and sat with it for a long time. "How do you know how to do this?" he asked. "When we lost the farm," she said, not looking up from her writing, "I tried to fight it. I didn't know how. I made mistakes. I didn't have the right documents. I didn't have the right witness statements. I didn't understand how the law read what I was claiming." She set the pencil down. "I lost because I didn't know how to speak the law's language. So I learned it. After. Too late for my farm." She looked at him. "Not too late for yours." There was something in her voice when she said it. Not performance, not sentiment, just the flat, clear sound of someone who had paid for knowledge the hard way and was now using it. Warren thought about the farm in Pennsylvania. About 31 years of work and then 4 years of loss and then $60 and a leather suitcase. He thought about the woman who'd written him a letter describing what she could do, practical and direct, and how it had not fully conveyed what was underneath it. Not just competence, but the specific kind of competence that comes from having been thoroughly defeated and choosing to rebuild yourself instead of staying broken. "The meeting Roy mentioned," he said. "When should we hold it?" "Soon," she said. "But not until Henderson responds. We need to know what we actually have before we tell everyone else what we're doing." Henderson's response arrived 11 days after Warren's letter. Fast for winter mail, which meant either the man kept a quick office or Agnes's routing system had worked better than expected. The letter came inside an envelope addressed to Agnes Kettridge as a fabric invoice, and Agnes sent it out with her next supply delivery along with a note that said simply, "Thought this might be of interest. AK." Warren opened it at the table with Margaret beside him. Henderson's letter was 3 pages, legal and careful. He had read Warren's account and had several questions, which he listed. He believed, based on the description of the fence incidents and the preliminary information provided, that there was potentially a viable case for intentional property interference, and if the water diversion could be properly documented, for unlawful water right manipulation under territorial statute. He noted that such cases were difficult and required thorough documentation. He noted that Sheriff Combs's response to Roy Pender's complaint about the water diversion would be relevant, as it potentially indicated official complicity. He said he would need to travel to Red Hollow to review the physical evidence in person. He asked when the ground would be accessible. "Spring," Warren said. "March, maybe late February, if the thaw comes early." 2 months, Margaret said. "Can we keep this quiet for 2 months?" Warren said. She thought about it. "We keep the meeting small. People Harlan can't reach." She looked at the letter. Henderson's right that the water diversion is key. Roy needs to find where that ditch ends before spring. I'll ride out to Roy's tomorrow, Warren said. See if we can plan that together. I'll come, she said. He almost said she didn't need to. He caught himself. All right, he said. The ride to Roy's place the next morning was 4 miles through frozen ruts, and they didn't talk much on the way out, which had become comfortable. The silence between them had changed in the 3 weeks since Margaret had arrived. It was no longer the silence of two strangers being careful with each other. It was more like the silence between people who knew they were thinking about the same things and didn't need to say it to confirm it. Roy was not alone when they got there. There was a man Warren didn't know, a younger man in his 30s with a territorial surveyor's mark on his saddlebag, sitting at Roy's kitchen table. Roy introduced him as Daniel Marsh, a surveyor out of Miles City who had come through on other business and had agreed, at Roy's asking, to look at the water diversion question. Daniel Marsh had a map, not a sketch like Roy's drawing, but an actual surveyor's plat of the Valley Water Corridor. He spread it on the table and Roy pointed to the location of the diversion, and Marsh traced the likely path of the redirected water with his finger, following the terrain contours. His finger stopped at a point on the map that was clearly labeled as Harlan Briggs's eastern pasture. That's where the ditch feeds, Marsh said. Based on the grade, the water's been going here. He tapped the map. And this parcel, he moved his finger slightly north, was filed for water access rights with the territorial office last spring. Warren looked at the date on the filing notation Marsh had written in the margin. It was 4 months after Roy had first knocked down the diversion structure. He looked at Margaret. She was looking at the map with an expression of quiet, careful attention. He filed for water rights that the diverted water would justify, she said. He created the water access and then filed the legal claim for it. While the legitimate downstream users were going dry, Marsh said, he said it neutrally, like a man stating survey data. I noticed the discrepancy when I was checking other filings in the corridor. I thought someone should know. Roy looked at Warren. Is that criminal? Henderson will know, Warren said, but it's close. Margaret was already reaching for the paper she'd brought in her coat pocket. Mr. Marsh, she said, would you be willing to write a surveyor's statement about what you've just told us? The plat, the grade analysis, the filing dates? Marsh looked at her. I'd need to see the physical diversion site first, to confirm the grade. Roy can take you there, she said. Can you go today? Ground's frozen, Marsh said. I can read the terrain. Then yes, Roy said. He was already standing up. They rode out to the diversion site, Roy and Marsh and Warren, with Margaret staying at Roy's cabin because the horse path to the creek was too narrow for 4 riders. Warren looked back once as they left, and she was already at Roy's table with Roy's account and Marsh's map notes, organizing. The diversion site was exactly what Roy had described. Even in winter, with the creek running slow under a skin of ice, you could see where the rock and timber structure had been rebuilt, rougher than Roy's drawing had suggested, cruder but functional. The ditch running northeast from it was clearly artificial, a straight line that nature doesn't make on its own. Marsh walked it with his instruments, noting grades, taking measurements with the focused efficiency of a professional doing what he's trained to do. Definitive, Marsh said when he'd finished. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular. This redirects approximately 30% of low-season flow, consistent with what I'd expect given the rights filing volume. You'll write the statement? Warren asked. I'll write the statement, Marsh said. They rode back to Roy's cabin, and when they came in, Margaret had organized Roy's table into what was, Warren realized, the best version of their file yet. Marsh's map notations incorporated, the timeline updated, the water rights filing date connected to the diversion construction timeline in a clear sequence that even someone who didn't know the territory could follow. Marsh looked at it for a long time. You put this together? He asked Margaret. With help, she said. This is more organized than most legal filings I've seen, he said. I've had practice, she said, and didn't elaborate. Warren stood in Roy Pender's kitchen and looked at the file Margaret had built. From his fence line and Roy's water diversion and Tom Kettridge's 6-year-old conversation and Agnes's witness documents and now a surveyor's plat and measurement data, And he thought about Harlan Briggs sitting in his saloon thinking he was dealing with a struggling rancher who was barely holding on, and how profoundly wrong that assumption had become. Harlan had laughed at the train station. He'd looked at Margaret Ellison with her worn coat and her single suitcase and her 56 years, and he'd written off what he was looking at. He'd made the same mistake everyone made. He'd seen the surface and stopped looking. Roy made coffee, and they sat around his table, the four of them, and talked through what they had and what they still needed and what Henderson would require in the spring. It was not a comfortable or a short conversation. Marsh asked difficult questions that none of them had full answers to. Roy was honest about the gaps in what he could prove. Warren named things he'd rather not have said out loud about the state of his finances and the gaps in his own documentation. But at the end of it, Marsh said, "If Henderson's as good as people say, you've got something real here. It's not a sure thing. Nothing's a sure thing when you're up against money, but it's real." On the ride back to the ranch, in the last gray afternoon light of a Montana winter day, Margaret was quiet for a long time. Warren matched her silence and waited. "He's going to find out," she said eventually, "about the surveyor, about the meeting. Someone will say something, or Harlan will notice Marsh in the territory, or one of the families will mention it to the wrong person." "Probably," Warren said. "When he does," she said, "he's going to move, not slow anymore. He's been patient because he thought time was on his side. When he realizes it's not—" She stopped. "He'll push," Warren said. "He'll push hard," she said. The horses moved through the frozen ruts, and the light faded, and the ranch came into view piece by piece the way it always did. Fence line, barn, cabin, smoke from the chimney. "I want you to know something," Warren said. She looked at him. "Whatever he does," Warren said, "I'm not selling. I'm not settling. I'm done walking soft with him." He paused. He wasn't a man who made speeches, and he knew this was coming out clumsy, but he said it anyway because it was true and she should hear it. "And I'm not doing this alone anymore." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You haven't been doing it alone," she said, "for 3 weeks." "I know," he said. "I'm saying I understand that now." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the road. "Let's get the animals fed," she said. "It's going to be a cold night." He let her have the last word, because it was the right one, and they drove the last half-mile to the ranch in the kind of silence that had stopped meaning distance and had started meaning something else, something harder to name but easier to live inside of. Harlan moved on a Tuesday. Warren knew something was wrong before he knew what it was, the way you know in a place you've lived long enough, when the ordinary sounds of a morning are slightly off, when the quality of the quiet is different from the quiet it should be. He was in the barn checking the water trough when he heard horses on the road, more than one, moving fast for the conditions, and he came out into the cold morning light and counted 3 riders before he got to the fence. Not Harlan himself. Harlan rarely came himself anymore. It was Dutch in front and Garrett beside him, and a third man Warren didn't recognize, heavy-set, town clothes under a ranch coat, carrying a leather satchel that didn't belong on a working rider. Warren stood at the fence and waited. Dutch pulled up and looked down at him with the expression of a man doing a job he's been told to do, rather than one he's chosen. "Blackwood," he said. "This here is Mr. Fitch. He's got papers." "Papers for what?" Warren said. Fitch urged his horse forward. He had the practiced, neutral face of a man who delivered bad news professionally. "Mr. Blackwood, I represent the interests of Mr. Harlan Briggs in the matter of a lien claim against this property." He opened the satchel and produced a folded document. "Mr. Briggs holds a note of debt against the previous owner of this land, transferred to him through a third-party acquisition in 1881. The note has been in arrears for—" "There is no note," Warren said. "For 4 years, and Mr. Briggs is exercising his right to file a lien claim against the property as collateral." "There is no note," Warren said again, louder and with more control than he felt. "My father settled every debt on this land before he died. I have the documentation." Fitch held the papers toward him. "You'll want to have someone review these, Mr. Blackwood. You have 30 days to respond to the territorial court before the claim—" "Get off my land," Warren said. Dutch shifted in his saddle. Garrett watched Warren with the careful attention of someone gauging distance. "Mr. Blackwood, I said get off my land." Warren was not shouting. His voice had gone very flat and very quiet, which in his experience communicated the essential point more effectively than shouting. You can leave those papers on the fence post if you want me to read them, but the three of you need to turn around in the next 30 seconds. Fitch looked at Dutch. Dutch looked at Warren for a moment, reading something in his face, and then he said to Fitch, "Leave them on the post." And Fitch leaned over and tucked the papers into the fence wire, and they turned and rode back the way they'd come. Warren stood at the fence until they were out of sight. Then he took the papers from the wire and walked back to the cabin. And the walk took about 40 seconds. And in those 40 seconds, he ran through everything he knew about his father's accounts and what he believed was in the records box under the bed and whether he actually had what he just claimed he had. And the answer was, he thought so, but he wasn't certain, and not certain wasn't good enough. Margaret was at the table when he came in. She took one look at his face and said, "What happened?" He put the papers on the table. She read them. She read them twice, quickly the first time, then slowly. He watched her face and it told him very little, which was either reassuring or not depending on how you looked at it. "Lien claim," she said, "based on an alleged debt note from 1878, transferred to Briggs through a company called Meridian Land Holdings in 1881. She looked up. "Do you know that name? Meridian?" "No," he said. "Have you ever seen any document from them?" "No." "Does your father's paperwork go back to 78? "It should," he said. "The records box. Under the bed." He was already moving. The records box had been under Warren's bed for 9 years. He'd looked in it exactly twice since his father died. Once when he'd needed the deed for a boundary survey, and once when he'd thought he'd lost a tax receipt. He pulled it out now and set it on the table and opened it, and the contents were in the state of organized chaos that characterized everything his father had ever filed. Folded papers sorted roughly by year, but with no consistent system, some dated clearly, some not dated at all, some written in his father's hand and some in hands Warren didn't recognize. Margaret looked at the box. She did not comment on its condition. She said, "What year is the alleged note from?" 1878, he said. "Then we start there and go forward to 81. She reached for the box. "Sit down. This is going to take a while." It took 2.5 hours. They went through every paper from 1875 to 1883, Warren reading his father's handwriting aloud when Margaret couldn't parse it, Margaret organizing the relevant documents into a separate pile and the irrelevant ones into another. Warren's father had not been a meticulous man, but he had been a thorough one. He'd kept receipts, kept correspondence, kept records of payments made in a small leather notebook that they found near the bottom of the box. In the notebook, dated September 12, 1879, was an entry that read, "Final payment on Hargrove note rendered in full. Receipt received. Balance 0. "Hargrove note," Margaret said. "Thomas Hargrove," Warren said. He remembered the name now from his father's stories. "He sold my father seed and equipment on credit in the early years. Father paid it off. I remember him talking about it. Said it was the best day of his life when that debt was clear." "Do you have the receipt?" They went back through the pile. Margaret found it 8 minutes later. A single folded receipt from Thomas Hargrove, dated September 14, 1879, acknowledging receipt of final payment and marking the debt settled in full. Margaret set it on the table between them. Harlan's note claims the debt was still active in 1881 when Meridian Land Holdings acquired it, she said. "This receipt says the debt was settled in full in 1879. She paused. "Either Harlan's document is forged, or Meridian purchased a note that was already settled without knowing it. Or, Warren said, Meridian purchased a note that was already settled and didn't care." Margaret looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's the more likely interpretation." He sat with that for a moment, the specific cold anger that came with understanding something you'd been slow to see. "He's had this in reserve," Warren said. "The lien. He's been holding it." "Waiting until the moment it would hurt most," she said. "After we contacted Henderson, after Roy started asking questions, after the surveyor came through, he's heard enough to know the situation is changing. This is meant to destabilize you before Henderson gets here." "It worked," Warren said, "for about 10 minutes. 10 minutes is fine," she said, "as long as you have the receipt." She picked up the Hargrove receipt and held it to the light from the window, examining it carefully. It was 47 years old and slightly foxed at the edges, but the ink was clear and Hargrove's signature was legible. She turned it over. The back was blank. "We need this witnessed and copied," she said. "Agnes—" "I know," he said. He was already reaching for his coat. "Warren." He stopped. She was looking at him with an expression he'd only seen on her a few times. Not alarm, but something adjacent to urgency, a slight change in the set of her jaw. "Take the ledger too, the one I've been working in, and the file." "Why?" "Because if Harlan is filing legal papers today," she said, "he may have people watching this place, and the only copies of our documentation are in this cabin." He understood. "I'll take the satchel," he said, the whole thing." "I'll stay and look through the rest of the box," she said. "There may be more." He looked at her. Sitting at his kitchen table with a records box full of his father's papers, in a ranch that had been a stranger's property 6 weeks ago, making decisions that affected everything he'd spent his life building. "Margaret," he said. She looked up. He almost said something sentimental. He was aware of the impulse and also aware that it would embarrass them both. "Look for anything with the name Meridian," he said. "I will," she said. He rode to town. Agnes was not alone in the dry goods store. There were 2 women Warren recognized as wives of men who worked Harlan's land, and their presence in the store at the same time as Warren was either coincidence or it wasn't. He bought a length of rope he didn't need and exchanged weather observations with Agnes while the other women finished their business and left. When the door closed, Agnes said quietly, "He filed the lien with the county clerk this morning. It's already in the book." "I have the settlement receipt," Warren said. 1879. Clear. Agnes let out a slow breath. "Good. Because there's something else." She moved to the end of the counter and spoke more quietly. "Sheriff Combs was in this morning, before the other women. He said the county assessor has opened a review of your property boundary on the eastern side. Formal review. Says there may be a surveying error in the original land grant." Warren went very still. "The boundary survey was done in 1863, he said. "I know," Agnes said, "and there's nothing wrong with it. But a formal review creates a cloud on the title, which means if Harlan's lien claim and a title dispute are both active at the same time," Warren said, "I can't sell, can't borrow against the land, and can't do much of anything," Agnes said, "until both are resolved." She paused. "How long would that take?" "With Combs cooperating with Harlan? Years, maybe." Agnes pressed her lips together. "He's boxing you in," she said. "He's trying to," Warren said. He laid the Hargrove receipt on the counter. "I need a witnessed copy, notarized." Agnes looked at it. She read it carefully. Something moved across her face that might, in another woman, have been called satisfaction. "I have the stamp right here," she said. While Agnes was making the copy, the door to the store opened and Roy Pender came in, which was either very good timing or Roy had been watching for Warren's horse. Probably the latter. Roy had the look of a man who'd ridden fast despite the cold. "You heard," Warren said. "Heard about the lien 20 minutes ago," Roy said. "Heard about the boundary review 10. He pulled off his gloves. He moved fast." "He was ready," Warren said. "He's had the lien in his pocket for a while, just needed the right moment." Roy looked at the receipt Agnes was copying. "Is that what I think it is?" "Settlement of the underlying debt," Warren said, "dated 1879, 2 years before Meridian allegedly acquired the note." "So the lien is fraudulent," Roy said. "Probably," Warren said, "but probably doesn't win in a territorial court." "Henderson," Roy said. "Henderson needs to be here," Warren said, "before the 30 days are up." Agnes stamped the notarized copy and handed it to Warren with the original. "I'm keeping a copy in my lockbox," she said, "in case something happens to yours." He looked at her. "Thank you, Agnes." "Don't thank me," she said. "Just win." He rode back to the ranch with the satchel and the documents and a list of problems that had grown since morning, and found Margaret at the table with 3 additional papers laid out in front of her, separated from the main pile. "Meridian," she said when he came in. He stopped. You found something. 2 letters, she said, addressed to your father, 1880 and 81, from a land agent named Corville, writing on behalf of Meridian Land Holdings, claiming your father owed an outstanding balance on the Hargrove note and requesting payment. Warren sat down. My father never mentioned this. He wouldn't have, Margaret said, because he had the settlement receipt. He knew the debt was clear. She turned one of the letters to face him. Look at the bottom. In his father's handwriting, in the margin of the letter. Responded October 14th, 1880. Debt settled, receipt referenced, no further correspondence required. He wrote back, Warren said. He told them he had the receipt. And they stopped writing, she said, because they knew the note was compromised. But Harlan filed the lien claim anyway, 8 months later, using a different mechanism. An alleged transfer through a third party, not a direct claim on the original note. She paused. He was hoping no one would make the connection between the Meridian letters and the original Hargrove note. Because no one would go through an old records box and find them together, Warren said. A man doing this alone under financial pressure, getting served legal papers. She didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. He understood. He would have been managing the shock of the lien claim and trying to remember what was in the records box and probably concluding that he wasn't sure what he had and maybe consulting a local lawyer who might or might not be in Harlan's circle, and the whole thing would have taken long enough that the 30 days would have passed before he'd assembled the full picture. He reached across the table and picked up the letters. Read them. Read them again. This is the pattern, he said. This is what you said in Roy's kitchen. Not individual incidents, a pattern over time. The Meridian letters tie the lien claim into the same campaign as the fence cutting, the water diversion, the boundary review, she said. They're not separate problems. They're the same hand, the same strategy, going back at least to 80. Henderson needs these. How fast can we get word to Henderson? Agnes's route, she said. Today. He wrote the letter to Henderson in 20 minutes, which was fast for him. He'd never been a quick writer, but the clarity of the situation helped. He laid out the Hargrove receipt, the Meridian letters, his father's notation, the sequence of events. He asked Henderson to come as soon as possible. He told him about the boundary review and the 30-day window on the lien. He signed it and addressed the outer envelope to Agnes as a fabric order and rode back to town. Agnes sent it out with the afternoon mail rider, tucked into a package of dry goods invoices. The next 3 days were quiet, in the way that a quiet can be either peaceful or threatening, depending on what's underneath it. Warren repaired fence and checked cattle and did the ordinary work of the ranch, and Margaret organized the documentation and wrote a clean summary that laid out every connected incident from 1879 to the present in clear sequence, and neither of them talked much about what was coming because there wasn't much useful to say about it yet. On the 4th day, Dutch came back. He came alone this time, no Fitch, no Garrett, and he came up the road at a pace that wasn't aggressive, and he stopped at the fence and waited, which was different from last time. Warren came out to meet him. Dutch was not a complicated man. He'd worked for Harlan because Harlan paid steady wages, and he did what he was told because that was the arrangement. And he had the look now of a man who had a thing he wanted to say and was figuring out the approach. I'm not here official, Dutch said. Warren waited. The surveyor, Dutch said. Marsh. I know he came through Roy Pender's place. Harlan knows too. He paused. I want you to know I didn't tell him. Who did? Warren said. Dutch looked off in the hills. Garrett's got a loose mouth, he said. He mentioned it in the saloon. Warren absorbed this. Why are you telling me? Dutch was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands, which was a gesture Warren had never seen from him. Dutch was not a man who fidgeted. I've worked for Harlan 11 years, he said. I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of. Some of them I didn't know the full shape of at the time. He paused. The fence. Last month. Warren went very still. I'm not saying I did it, Dutch said carefully. I'm saying I know who did. Garrett, Warren said. Dutch didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. He settled his hat back on his head. I've got a sister in Kansas, he said. I've been thinking about going to see her. He gathered his reins. I thought you should know about Garrett. He turned his horse and rode back toward town. Warren stood at the fence for a long time after he left. When he came inside, Margaret looked at his face and said, "Tell me." He told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "He's not going to give you a sworn statement." "No," Warren said. "But he told you," she said, "which means he's uncomfortable enough with what's happened that he wanted someone to know, even if he won't say it formally." "Henderson can't use it," Warren said. "Henderson can't use it directly," she said. "But if Garrett is the one who cut the fence and he's still in the area, and Henderson knows to look at him." She paused. "People with loose mouths in saloons say things that become evidence in ways they don't anticipate." Warren looked at her. "You've thought about this kind of thing before." "I've thought about what it's like to have the truth and not be able to prove it," she said. "It's a particular kind of frustrating. You learn to find the gaps." That night, after supper, they sat by the fire longer than usual. Warren had gotten into the habit of sitting a while before turning in, which he hadn't done when he was alone because sitting alone by a fire at the end of a long day had a quality he'd found difficult to endure. It was different now. He wasn't sure exactly when it had changed or what specific moment he could point to, but the shape of the evenings was different. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can always ask," she said. "When Henderson gets here," he said, "and this is resolved one way or another." He stopped. "I'm not assuming it goes our way. I've seen enough to know it might not." "It might not," she agreed. "If it doesn't," he said. "If Harlan wins this. If the land—" He stopped again. Margaret looked at him across the fire. She'd learned to wait when he was working towards something, not fill in the sentence for him, which he appreciated. "I want you to know that whatever happens to the land," he said, "is separate from what I want to happen with this." He made a gesture that was somewhat vague and encompassed the cabin and the fire and the two of them. "I didn't bring you here for the ranch. Or I did, originally, but it's not—" He was making a mess of this. He was aware of that. "What I'm trying to say is that you're not here because of what you can contribute to the operation." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Warren," she said. "I know it's not well said," he said. "It's fine," she said. "I understood it." She looked at the fire. "I want you to know something too. When I answered your advertisement, you described a situation and I described a skill set, and it was a transaction. I understood that. I accepted it." She turned her cup in her hands. "It's not that now." "No," he said. "It's not." "I don't know what it is exactly," she said. "I don't think we need to name it yet." "No," he said. "We probably don't." The fire settled. Outside, the wind had come up again, not a storm, just the ordinary Montana winter wind that was always looking for gaps in things. "The cattle in the east pasture," she said after a while. "Two of them have been off their feed. Did you notice?" He had not noticed. "No," he said. "I'll look at them tomorrow morning," she said. "Might be nothing. Might be the cold." "Might be," she said. "But I want to look." She went to bed not long after, the way she always did, practically, without ceremony. He stayed by the fire a while longer, which was a thing he did now without having decided to start doing it. He thought about the documents in the satchel and Henderson coming in the spring and Harlan Briggs with his patience and his money and his long game, and he thought that Harlan had built everything on the assumption that time wore people down, and isolation wore people down, and pressure applied consistently from multiple angles wore people down. And it did. Warren had felt it wearing him down year by year the way water wore stone. What Harlan hadn't calculated was that Warren would go looking for a practical arrangement and instead find a woman who had already been worn down to bedrock and had discovered that bedrock was where you built from. He let the fire burn low and went to check the cattle one last time before bed, the way he always did, except that now when he came back in, he made sure the latch on the door was solid, and he set the satchel with the documentation on the shelf where he could see it from the bed, and he lay in the dark and listened to the wind find the gaps and fail to get through them. Henderson's response arrived 6 days later. He was coming. He would be in Red Hollow by the 22nd, which gave them 4 days before he arrived. He had reviewed the information they'd sent through Agnes and had consulted with a colleague in the territorial capital who confirmed that the Meridian Land Holdings Company had a disputed history. Two similar lien actions in other counties, both eventually withdrawn when recipients produced debt settlement documentation, one currently under review by the Territorial Attorney General's office. Margaret read that last sentence twice. "He's done this before," she said. "Meridian, the same play, in other places." "And been caught," Warren said. "And walked away," she said. "Both times the action was withdrawn before it became a formal proceeding, which means no court record, no precedent." She set the letter down. "He's careful. He pushes until someone pushes back in a serious way, and then he withdraws before it sticks." "So he's going to withdraw," Warren said. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe this time he's too far in. The water rights filing, the boundary review, those are formal actions on record. Those don't disappear quietly." She picked up the letter again. "He may not be able to walk away from this the way he has before." "Which makes him more dangerous," Warren said. "Yes," she said. She said it without flinching, which was one of the things he had come to rely on without having noticed he was relying on it. Her willingness to say the difficult true thing instead of the comfortable approximation of it. "Roy needs to know Henderson is coming," he said. "Agnes too," she said. "And we should think about who else ought to be in Red Hollow when he arrives. Anyone with a piece of this story that Henderson should hear directly." He thought about it. "Roy, Agnes, Tom Kettridge, if he can travel." He paused. "Marsh, if he's still in the territory." "I'll write to Roy today," she said. "He can reach Marsh if anyone can." She wrote the letter, and he wrote it to Agnes, and on the way back the road took him past the eastern fence line, and he pulled up for a moment and looked at the section of fence where Margaret had found the cut wire on her first morning. It had been repaired. He'd done it himself, solid work, posts reset and wire tight. But he stood there and looked at it, and thought about Garrett with his loose mouth and Dutch heading for Kansas, and Harlan Briggs in his saloon planning the next move. And he thought that the thing about a long game was that eventually it became too long for the man playing it. Eventually you ran up against someone who had more patience than you'd accounted for. He turned his horse back toward the ranch, toward the cabin with its smoke and its fire, and the woman at the table who had come here with a leather suitcase and $60 worth of hard experience. And he rode through the cold with the particular feeling of a man who has finally stopped facing the wrong direction. Henderson arrived on the 22nd, as promised, on a gray morning that couldn't decide whether it wanted to snow or just threaten it. He was younger than Warren had expected. Mid-40s, lean, with the kind of face that gave nothing away by habit rather than by effort. He came off the stage in Red Hollow with a single case and looked around the town the way Margaret had looked around the train station on her first day, not with judgment, just with the focused attention of someone who needed to understand his surroundings before he could work in them. Warren had brought the wagon. Margaret had come with him, which Henderson's eyes noted without comment when Warren made the introduction. "Mrs. Blackwood," Henderson said, shaking her hand. "Warren's correspondence indicated you've been central to organizing the documentation." "I had the time and the fresh eyes," she said. "Warren had the history." "Combination I'd ask for if I could order it," Henderson said, and picked up his case. They ate supper at the cabin that night. Henderson and Roy Pender and Agnes Kettridge, who had closed the store early and driven out in her own buggy with Tom's written account and the file copies she'd been keeping in her lockbox. Warren built the fire up and Margaret made enough food for 6 people, which was the right call because the conversation was long and detailed and the kind of work that required something warm in front of you. Henderson went through everything. He asked questions the way good lawyers ask questions, not to hear himself talk, but because the answer actually mattered to the next question. He read Tom Kettridge's account twice. He examined the Hargrove receipt and the Meridian letters, and his father's notation with the careful attention of a man who knew what he was looking for and had found it. He asked Roy to describe the water diversion structure in precise detail, asked about the timber quality again, new wood or seasoned, and wrote down Roy's answer. He asked Margaret about the fence. She described what she'd seen, the cut points, the cleanliness of the wire ends, the location relative to the boundary, the freshness. And Henderson listened and wrote and then asked, "How certain are you of the distance? 200 yards north of the boundary?" "I paced it," she said. "I know my pace. It was between 180 and 220. I said 200 because that's the middle estimate." "Could you identify the location again if you needed to?" Yes, she said, without difficulty. Henderson looked at her for a moment. You'd be willing to testify to that? It wasn't quite a question. If it comes to that, she said. Yes. Agnes said, she'd be the best witness you have. Harlan spent years making sure the people in this valley see what they expect to see. Margaret didn't know what to expect. She just looked. Henderson nodded slowly. He turned back to the Meridian documents. The Territorial Attorney General's office has been looking at Meridian for 14 months, he said. 2 previous lien actions, both withdrawn. What I didn't know until I made some inquiries last week is that the same man appears to be connected to all 3 actions. He paused. A land agent named Corville, the same name on the letters your father received. Warren looked at Margaret. Corville works for Harlan directly? Roy said. I can't prove that yet, Henderson said. What I can show is that Corville has acted as intermediary in all 3 Meridian lien actions in this territory, and that in each case the target was a landowner with a water access corridor that Harlan Briggs subsequently acquired or attempted to acquire. He closed his folder. That is a pattern. Patterns are what courts use when direct evidence is limited. Is it enough? Warren asked. Henderson was quiet for a moment. He was a man who chose his words carefully, which Warren appreciated. For the lien claim, yes. The Hargrove receipt and your father's correspondence with Meridian established that the underlying note was settled before Meridian allegedly acquired it. That claim will not survive a court challenge. He paused. For the water diversion, stronger than I expected because of Marsh's surveyor's statement and the territorial filing dates. The sequence is very clear. Another pause. For the boundary review, that's the weakest piece. It's a formal process and it takes time. I can file to stay it pending the resolution of the other matters, which a reasonable judge would grant. Is the judge in this county reasonable? Agnes asked. Henderson looked at her. Not particularly, he said, which is why I've already been in contact with the circuit judge out of Miles City, who will be sitting in Red Hollow next month for the winter session. A silence. You planned ahead, Warren said. I read your letters carefully, Henderson said. When you described Sheriff Combs and the assessment of the water diversion as a beaver dam, I understood what kind of county operation we were dealing with. He pulled a document from his case. I'm filing the response to the lien claim tomorrow morning at the county clerk's office, formally, with the original Hargrove receipt attached and a notarized copy of your father's notation. I'm also filing a formal complaint with the Territorial Attorney General regarding the Meridian land holdings pattern of activity, referencing all 3 lien actions. He looked around the table. After tomorrow, Harlan Briggs will know exactly what we have. And then he moves, Roy said. And then he moves, Henderson agreed. Or he doesn't. In my experience, men who've avoided formal proceedings for years have a strong preference for continuing to avoid them. The question is whether he believes he can still win or whether the cost of continuing exceeds the benefit. He's put a lot into this, Warren said. Years. He has, Henderson said, which cuts both ways. He can't easily walk away from the water rights filing. That's a formal territorial record. If we prove the diversion was constructed to justify a fraudulent filing, that's a serious matter. Serious enough that the Attorney General's office would be interested. He paused. Men who've always controlled the board don't always respond well when the pieces stop going where they're supposed to. He said it matter-of-factly, and everyone at the table understood what he meant. After Henderson and Agnes had gone, Roy staying the night in the empty bunkhouse, which had been aired out and given a fire for the occasion, Warren and Margaret sat at the table with the remains of the meal between them, and Warren felt something he hadn't felt in so long he had to identify it carefully before he believed it. Not relief. It was too early for relief. More like the sense of having reached solid ground after a long time crossing uncertain footing. Not safe, not finished, but standing on something real. You said once that you learned the law's language too late for your own farm, he said. She was stacking the plates. She stopped. I remember, she said. It wasn't too late, he said. It was exactly the right time. You just didn't have the right ground to use it on yet. She stood with the plates in her hands and looked at him, and something moved through her face that she didn't quite manage to keep still. Not tears. Margaret Ellison was not a woman who cried at tables, but something in that territory, a brief unguarding. "That's a generous reading," she said. "It's an accurate one," he said. She set the plates down and sat back at the table. "I used to lie awake in my sister's house, in Pennsylvania, the second year after the farm, and think about what I should have done differently. Every decision laid out, examined, judged." She paused. "You do that when you've lost something. You go back over it, trying to find where you went wrong, as if knowing will somehow fix it." "Does it?" he said. "No," she said. "It just exhausts you." She looked at her hands on the table. "What actually helps is finding something to do that requires your full attention, something that needs what you know and wants what you can give." She looked up at him. "That's what this is?" He nodded. "I know I'm not easy," he said, "to live with. I'm quiet and I'm set in habits and I don't—" He stopped. "I don't always know how to say what I mean." "You say it eventually," she said. "That's enough." "Is it?" She considered him. "Warren, I'm 56 years old. I've been married to a man who talked constantly and warmly and filled every room he was in, and I loved him, and I had a good life with him, and I still lost everything." She paused. "I didn't come here looking for Edwin. I came here looking for something real that I could help build. That's what I have." She paused again. "That's enough. That's more than enough." He held on to that through the night. Henderson filed in the morning. By noon, word had reached the saloon. By mid-afternoon, Harlan Briggs rode out to the ranch himself. He came alone, which was either a good sign or a bad one. Warren wasn't sure which. And he came up to the fence and sat his horse and looked at the cabin with an expression that Warren, watching from the barn door, read as controlled but not entirely controlled. The control was working harder than usual. Warren walked to the fence. Margaret came out of the cabin and stood on the step. She didn't come to the fence, but she was visible, which was its own kind of statement. Harlan looked at Warren. "You've made a serious mistake," he said. "Which one?" Warren said. Harlan's jaw tightened. "Henderson's filing is a provocation. What you're claiming about Meridian is documented," Warren said. "Your lawyer's seen the Hargrove receipt. You know what it means." "What I know," Harlan said, and his voice had dropped to the register he used when he wanted to be certain people understood he was serious, "is that this county has operated a particular way for 30 years. And one lawyer from Miles City and a woman who's been here 6 weeks don't change 30 years in an afternoon." "The territorial attorney general might," Warren said. A silence. The wind moved between them. "You're reaching," Harlan said. "Maybe," Warren said. "You want to find out?" Harlan looked at him. Warren had known Harlan Briggs for 10 years, and he had never in those 10 years seen him uncertain. He'd seen him angry, he'd seen him calculating, he'd seen him perform warmth and perform threat with equal facility. He had not seen what was currently moving behind his eyes, which was something adjacent to the look of a man who has been playing chess and has just realized the other player is 2 moves ahead on a board he thought he understood. He looked past Warren at Margaret. "You brought this on yourself," he said. Not to Warren, to her. She looked back at him from the step. "You started this years before I arrived," she said. "I just helped finish it." Harlan held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. He didn't threaten again. He didn't make promises. He just turned and rode back toward town, and Warren watched him go, and Margaret watched him go. And when he was out of sight, Warren let out a breath that he'd been holding since Harlan had ridden up. He turned around. Margaret was still on the step. "He's going to try something else," she said. "Probably," Warren said. "But not that," she said. "Not the lien, not the boundary review. Those are done." "Henderson thinks so," Warren said. "Henderson's right," she said. And then, almost to herself, "He's used to people who have something to lose being afraid of losing it. He doesn't know what to do with people who've already lost everything and built back up." Warren walked back toward the cabin. When he reached the step, he stopped and looked at her. "We," he said. She looked at him. "You said people," he said. "You meant we." She looked at him for a moment. A corner of her mouth moved. "Yes," she said. "I meant we." The circuit judge arrived in Red Hollow on the 14th of February. A date that struck Warren as either ironic or fitting, he couldn't decide which, and sat for 3 days. The lien claim hearing took 40 minutes. Henderson presented the Hargrove receipt, the Meridian letters, the Elder Blackwood's notation and correspondence. Harlan's attorney, a man brought up from Billings, argued that the settlement receipt's authenticity was uncertain. Henderson produced Agnes's notarized copy and the original side by side, and noted that the paper and ink had been examined and were consistent with documents from the 1870s, and that the Billings attorney was welcome to have them independently verified at his client's expense. The Billings attorney declined. The circuit judge dismissed the lien claim with a notation that the underlying note appeared to have been settled prior to the alleged transfer and referred the Meridian land holdings matter formally to the Territorial Attorney General's office. Harlan sat through it with his controlled face and his controlled posture and said nothing. The water diversion hearing was the following morning and took longer. Marsh testified. Roy testified. Henderson laid out the surveyor's plat, the grade analysis, the territorial water rights filing date against the construction timeline of the diversion. The Billings attorney challenged Marsh's methodology on 3 technical points, 2 of which Marsh answered with specifics that left no room to maneuver, and 1 of which Henderson addressed with a second surveyor's statement he'd obtained from a colleague in Miles City who had reviewed Marsh's data. The circuit judge was a compact woman in her 50s named Eleanor Voss, who had the air of someone who had been in rooms like this for a long time and found the performances of men with money somewhat less impressive than those men tended to assume. She asked several questions of her own during the testimony, direct and precise, and wrote the answers down herself. She ruled that the water diversion constituted an unlawful modification of a shared water corridor under territorial statute, ordered it removed at Harlan's expense within 60 days, and vacated the water rights filing on the grounds that it was based on artificially diverted flow that Harlan had no lawful claim to. She referred the matter of the filing itself to the Attorney General's office as a companion to the Meridian referral. She also, in a brief addendum that made the Billings attorney go very still, noted that the pattern of activity documented across the 3 proceedings, the lien action, the water diversion, the formally challenged boundary review, suggested a coordinated course of conduct, and that the court was forwarding its findings to the Territorial Attorney General's office with that characterization included. Harlan left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Warren stood on the courthouse steps in the February cold with Henderson on one side and Margaret on the other, and Roy Pender and Agnes Kettridge behind them, and he felt something he wasn't sure he had the right language for. "The boundary review?" he asked Henderson. "Stays suspended pending the Attorney General's review," Henderson said. In practical terms, with 2 referrals already going to that office, the county assessor is unlikely to push forward on a formal action that's directly connected to the pattern Judge Voss just put on the record. He paused. "It's not fully resolved. I won't tell you it is. But Harlan's room to maneuver is substantially smaller than it was 2 weeks ago." "Will the Attorney General pursue it?" Roy asked. "The Meridian pattern across 3 counties gives them something worth pursuing," Henderson said. "Whether they do is not in my hands, but the record is there." He looked at Warren. "You've done what you can do. The rest is the territory's business." Warren shook his hand. Agnes hugged Margaret, which seemed to surprise Margaret slightly, and then Agnes hugged her again as if to make the point, and Margaret let her. Roy Pender shook Warren's hand and then, unexpectedly, shook Margaret's. "You know," Roy said to her, "when Warren first wrote that advertisement, half the county thought he'd lost his mind." "I heard something like that," Margaret said. "The other half thought he was desperate," Roy said. "That's probably fair," Warren said. Roy looked between them. "They were all wrong," he said. He said it simply, without ceremony, the way he said most things, and then he put his hat on and went to get his horse. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, in the way that things are quiet after something long and heavy has been set down. The horses knew the road. The February sky had cleared to a pale, hard blue, and the snow on the hills caught the afternoon light in a way that made the landscape look not beautiful exactly. Warren was not a man who reached for that word, but like itself, clearly and completely. "It's not over," Margaret said. "No," he said. "He still owns what he owns," she said. He's still here. Yes, Warren said, but he's not here the same way. He thought about how to say it. He's been running the same play for years because nobody could see the whole board. Now everybody's seen it. Agnes, Roy, Judge Voss, the Attorney General's office. He paused. He doesn't have the advantage of invisibility anymore. People like that don't disappear, she said. They recalculate. I know, he said, but recalculating takes time. And while he's recalculating, we have work to do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the East Pasture fence. We should replace the whole south run, not just the cut section. The posts are old. He almost smiled. In the spring, he said, and the smokehouse roof. Also spring. And that north wall in the cabin needs proper insulation before next winter, not hay stuffed in a gap. Margaret, she looked at him. We'll get to it, he said. She settled back on the wagon bench. I know, she said. I'm just making the list. You're always making the list, he said. Someone has to, she said. He let that stand because it was true. The ranch came into view the way it always did. Fence line first, then barn, then cabin with its stone chimney. 3 months ago, he had driven this road alone, and the ranch had looked like what it was. A place that was holding on, just barely, through the force of habit and the absence of alternatives. It looked different now. He wasn't sure he could have said precisely what had changed in the physical facts of the place. The fence was the same, the barn was the same, the cabin was the same cabin his grandfather had built, and his father had expanded and he had repaired imperfectly for 9 years. But something in the way he looked at it had shifted, the way a room looks different when it's no longer empty. He unhitched the horses and Margaret went inside, and he stayed in the barn a few minutes doing the small closing up tasks of the end of a day. And Button, the brown and white calf, 7 weeks old when she'd almost died in the December storm, 4 months old now and solidly built and inclined to follow Margaret around the barn in a way that Warren found privately entertaining, pressed her head against his arm. All right, he said to her. He scratched behind her ears. All right. He came inside to find Margaret at the stove and the cabin warm and the smell of supper in the air, and he hung his coat and sat at the table that had a ring from Roy's coffee cup and a small ink stain from the corner of the ledger and a nick in the wood from a time Warren had been careless with a knife. And he thought that a table with marks on it was a table that had been used, and a place that had been used was a place that was lived in. She set a plate in front of him and sat down across from him with her own. They ate. The fire worked. Outside, the February night came in cold and certain, the way Montana nights did, without apology. Thank you, he said. She looked up. For supper? For everything, he said. Since the beginning, the fence line, the records box, the file, the judge, all of it. She looked at him steadily. You gave me a place to be useful, she said. You don't thank a person for using what they have. I'm thanking the person, he said, not the usefulness. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at her plate. You're getting better at saying what you mean, she said. I'm working on it, he said. They sat through supper and the long, quiet evening that followed, and the fire did what fires do in cold places, and somewhere in the middle of an ordinary silence, Warren thought about what Harlan had said at the fence. You brought this on yourself, and how he'd meant it as a threat, and how it had turned out to be the truest thing he'd ever said, just not in the way he'd intended. She had brought something on herself. The fence line walked at first light on the first morning, the records box emptied and organized, the letters to Henderson, the meetings with Roy, the file built from nothing over weeks, piece by piece, because she had paid for this knowledge with a farm and 4 years of loss, and she wasn't going to let it be worth nothing. People talked about strength as if it were something you were born with or weren't, a quantity fixed at birth, either sufficient or lacking. Warren had believed that more or less without thinking about it too hard. He'd watched people fold under pressure and assumed they'd had less of whatever it was. He'd watched people hold and assumed they'd had more. What he understood now, watching Margaret clear the plates with the same steady economy of motion she'd had since the first night, was that it wasn't quantity. It was knowledge. The particular knowledge that comes from having lost badly and chosen to get up anyway, not because the situation was good or the odds were favorable, but because the alternative was to stay down, and staying down was its own kind of choice. And some people looked at that choice and said, not yet, not today. Margaret Ellison had said not today on a lot of days. She'd said it in a house that wasn't hers and on charity that didn't fit, and she'd said it alone, and she'd gotten on a train to Montana in December to say it somewhere that needed saying, with someone who needed to hear it. He'd thought he was offering her a place. She'd known she was bringing one. "It's going to be a cold night," she said from the window. "Always is in February," he said. "Calves need checking before we sleep." "I'll go," he said. "We'll go," she said. He didn't argue. He got his coat and she got hers, and they went out into the cold together, the way they'd gone into the blizzard in December, without ceremony, because that was what the situation required, and they were both people who did what the situation required without needing to make a speech about it first. The barn was warm with animal heat and the smell of hay and the sounds of settled creatures. Button lifted her head when Margaret came in and then set it back down reassured. The horses were easy. The older calves were fine. Warren checked the water troughs and the roof bracing and the south wall gap, which was properly insulated now, done right, no hay stuffed into it as a temporary measure. "All right?" Margaret asked. "All right," he said. They latched the barn and walked back to the cabin, and the stars were hard and clear in the February dark, the kind of stars you only get in cold, clean air far from anywhere crowded. And Warren looked at them for a moment before going inside because he'd been doing that lately, just taking a moment to look at the things around him. He held the door for her. She went in. He looked at the stars a moment longer. Then he followed her and shut the door against the cold. And that was enough. That was exactly enough.